Welcome to this webinar, Driving Forces Behind Green Transitions, comparing governmental green strategies in the EU, South Korea, and the US. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm events lead at Agora Energiewende. The European Green Deal in December 2019, the Green New Deal for South Korea in July 2020, and the 10-year Green Transition Investment Program as part of the US Inflation Reduction Law in August 22. We've seen several efforts in the past years showing economies are striving to reconcile environmental and climate policies with economic growth. And in a study which is very soon to be published, Agora Energiewende, with the support of the Korea Foundation, has taken a closer look into the before mentioned deals and programs. And today you, dear audience, are very lucky because we have several of the contributors to the studies on stage, and they will be showing the results of the study before the study actually goes public. So now what's planned for the next 60 minutes? Straightforward, we will have 3 presentations on the EU, on South Korea, and on the US. And then there's time for your questions in a Q&A session. And as I said earlier, don't be shy. Put any questions, anything you wonder why, anything you may be in doubt or anything you support into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have enough colleagues also, not just in front of the curtain, but also behind the curtain, so to say, to address them. And we very much look forward to your input also. But now let me hand over to the moderator of today's webinar. That's Dimitri Pescia. He is Program Lead Southeast Asia at Agora Energiewende, and actually one of the first colleagues who I was able to send into a webinar. I think we already started doing that in, when was it, Dimitri? 2014 or 15? So way before the pandemic all forced us into webinars. So I'm very much looking forward to your moderation today because you're such an experienced webinar person. I hand over to you, Dimitri, and look forward to the event.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. It's my pleasure to be moderating and presenting this event today with you. As you just mentioned, Nicola, I think the last 3 years have been important in the emergence of major Green Deal policy frameworks. But the last few years have also seen a very busy international agenda with the COVID pandemic, of course, and post-recovery measures, but also with the worldwide net zero commitments. We saw also dramatic climate events all around the world, specifically in 2022. And of course, the energy crisis, which has been fueled by the Russian war of invasion in Ukraine. So we believe this is actually a very good time to evaluate the current status of these green strategies, to see if they are really driving the green transition, if they have been implemented as it was initially planned in the context of this very dynamic policy environment, but also how could they be refined, and maybe also look at how they interact with each other, especially in the context of raising concerns about protectionist measures and potential misalignment between climate and trade policies. So as you just said, this project has been supported by the Korean Foundation, and we thank the Korean Foundation for their support. And the report will be published in a few days. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you the panelists. So the first one will be Claudio Bazzianti, who is project manager at Agora Energiewende, focusing on EU sustainable finance. Will give us an overview on the European Green Deal focus. Then we will have Sae-Ro Keong, who is visiting research fellow at Agora's partner in Korea, which is Next Group. She will introduce the Korean Green Deal framework. And last but not least, we will have Janek Steitz, who is a project manager at Agora, but also fellow for Dezernat Zukunft, who will give us a view on the American or US Inflation Reduction Act. And all of this will be followed by Q&A. So I'm looking forward to have this discussion with you. And Claudio, please, you can take the floor and introduce your findings to the audience.
Thank you, Dimitri. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my slides. So I'm going here in these 10 minutes to introduce the European Green Deal and discuss how it evolved since it has been launched in 2019, and also explain how all of this is
Sorry, Claudio.
Yes.
Sorry, Claudio, for interrupting. May I just ask you to use the presentation mode? Now there you go. That's perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. So, well, sorry about that. So it's, it happens. So the European Green Deal is the name of the climate strategy of the von der Leyen Commission. And the Commission in December 2019 has published a communication with this name in which it outlined not only the new climate strategy, but also the detailed legislative work plan. And here, for reasons of time, I'm only going to mention the main initiatives and the discontinuities with the past. And the first part of the European Green Deal is the revision of the climate targets. It makes, first of all, the climate neutrality by 2050 objective legally binding, and it upgrades the 2030 climate targets. So previously, the 2030 climate target in the EU was to reduce greenhouse gases emissions by at least 40% compared to the 1990 levels. The number now has been increased by a reduction of at least 55%. And these are important changes because it makes and they were also necessary because they made the EU more consistent with its commitment to the Paris Agreement. Then setting new targets requires, of course, also a review of the existing regulations and to make sure they will be delivered. And as you may know, that the European Commission is in charge of setting most of the regulation that apply at the European level in the area of climate and environmental policy. So this endeavor is taking the name of, you might have heard of Fit for 55 policy package. That is an impressive legislative effort by the Commission to reform legislation in different climate-relevant areas, from agriculture to renewables and to many other sectors. So you can see here visually on the left-hand side what the 2030 climate revision of the 2030 climate target implies for the emission trajectory. And so the EU will have to cut by 2030 roughly as many tons of emissions as it did between 1990 and 2021. Then on the right-hand side, you see the specific target set for the penetration of renewable energy. And the EU Green Deal brought it to 40%, so a share of renewables in gross final energy consumption by 2030 of 40%. This target has been recently revised upward with the REPowerEU plan to 45%, and this plan is actually the European response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the desire to decouple from the Russian supply of gas. So they are both quite ambitious targets, and reaching them requires much more stringent climate policies compared to the past. Now here I want to mention three other novelties of the European Green Deal. The first is an initiative called the Renovation Wave to push for scaling up of the renovation of buildings in Europe with the target of renovating 35 million homes by 2030. Then the creation of a just transition mechanism that is a funding scheme made of different financial instruments, grant, loans, guarantees that target the regions that are most dependent on carbon-intensive industry, for instance, coal mining, and that will help them that will support them through the transition. Another important novelty is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. At this point has been widely discussed also internationally, and you might have heard of that even outside of Europe. And this is a system that is supposed to replace the existing free allowances mechanism that at the moment is supporting European industry to cope with the risk of carbon leakage. And so they will shift from a system of giving allowances in the emission trading scheme for free to actually make everyone pay for the carbon pricing, including the foreign exporters to Europe, creating a level playing field. Now, there are two updates to the European Green Deal. That is, the first in response to the COVID-19 pandemic is the Next Generation EU, informally called the European Recovery Plan. That is that had a financial endowment of up to 800 billion euros, and that helped supporting the recovery and provided a lot of actually financial firepower for implementing the European Green Deal. Then in May 2022, as I already mentioned, the Repower EU plan that provides a lot of new power, I would say, to the speeded up the implementation of the EU Green Deal in several areas. First of all, in the deployment of renewable energy. So, in terms of timeline, since the EU Green Deal was launched in December 2019, there was a long phase of implementation, and we are still this is still not finished, with the new targets turning to law in March 2020 in the climate law proposal, and then September 2020 with a comprehensive impact assessment done by the Commission on the whole strategy, and then the Fit for 55 package was published by the Commission, proposed in July 2021. Now I want to conclude talking about how all of this is financed. This is a European initiative, and in general, policies in Europe are mostly implemented in terms of financing at the national level, because the size of the EU budget is relatively limited. The EU budget traditionally is 1% of GDP. That is a very small share compared to national budgets. So, but still, the European Green Deal offers some important novelties and more funding for investing in climate protection. And here on the left, you see graphics illustrating the EU Green Deal investment plan. So, how the Commission planned to finance the delivery of the European Green Deal. And you have some important components that are, first, the multi-annual financial framework, what's usually called the EU budget. You see it in there in the center. There was a top-up from the Next Generation EU, in particular the Recovery and Resilience Facility after the COVID pandemic. And on top of that, you have also some other instruments like lending facilities, like the InvestEU facility that, together with national promotional banks and the European Investment Bank, provide financial support to firms and public authorities across Europe for doing green investment. Moreover, as you may know, in Europe there is an emission trading scheme where that is generating revenues for governments as firms pay for polluting, and these revenues feed into a two major funds, one called the Innovation Fund and the other the Modernization Fund, that are also used for supporting green investment. And if you compare what we have in terms of financial firepower, financial endowment for spending on climate protection after the European Green Deal, so that applies to the current EU budget period, 2021-2027, is significantly larger. You see it here on the right-hand side, compared to what was available in the previous EU budget period. And very importantly, this increase came after the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery plans. So this is my last slide. Thank you very much. And I give the mic again to Dimitri.
Thanks a lot, Claudio, for this very comprehensive and clear framework presentation on the EU Green New Deal. It's also good to see the latest developments since the last 2 years and adapting to the latest political development. We will dig in more detail in the discussion afterwards. And I suggest we go straight to another part of the world and we'll ask Serok, who is actually a visiting fellow at Agora Energy and currently working for a Next Group, a think tank based in Seoul, to present your perspective on the Korean Green Deal. The floor is yours, Serok.
Thank you, Dimitri. I start my presentation with sharing the screen. Yes. Hello, everyone. It is a very great honor to give a presentation today. I'm Serok from Next Group based in Seoul and currently working as a visiting researcher at Agora Energiewende. From now on, I'd like to talk about the framework and policy implementation on the Korean Green New Deal and its evaluation as a driving force for the green transition. The emergence of Korean Green New Deal was strongly related with pandemic situation. The previous President Moon announced the Korean New Deal on July 2020 as a measure to revitalize the economy following the COVID-19 pandemic. The Korean New Deal consists of three main pillars: digital, green, and safety net is that. Totally 114 trillion Korean won of the national budget, which is about $94.5 billion US dollars, was announced to be spent for the next 5 years for the New Deal projects. Among them, 42.7 trillion Korean won was allocated to the Green New Deal. The bottom line of the Korean Green New Deal is a green economic stimulus designed to accelerate the transition to an environment-friendly and low-carbon green economy. It was born from the awareness that the fossil fuel-based manufacturing, which is Korean economy's traditional growth driver, were slowing down. Therefore, Korean Green New Deal's target was not only about the climate mitigation, but also about the job creation. The government expected to reduce cumulatively 12.3 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions through Green New Deal and to create 659,000 jobs by 2025. As you can see in the left figure, the Korean Green New Deal has three main focus areas: a green transition of infrastructure to protect against climate and environmental risk, the promotion of low carbon and decentralized energy sources, and lastly, the development of a green industrial innovation ecosystem. And each focus area includes specific projects such as turning public facilities into zero energy buildings, promoting renewables, expanding the supply of electric vehicles, and so on. Along with the specific projects, the first year of implementation of Green New Deal saw an increase in public and private green investment. Several successful performances were achieved in the areas of renewables and mobility, for instance. In addition, various significant institutional improvements were also carried out, such as the introduction of PPAs, the enactment of the Hydrogen Act, and the declaration of 2050 carbon neutrality announced in October 2020. As the initial version of the Green New Deal was not based on the carbon neutrality ambition, it needed to be revised, reflecting the strengthened climate target. Accordingly, the government announced the version of 2.0 in July 2021 and expanded the budget by 18.3 trillion won, which is equivalent of 40% increase. And then the Carbon Neutrality Act was enacted in the September 2021. By describing the mid and long-term national climate target at the Act, the climate target could get binding power regardless of potential administration's change. Furthermore, the government adopted a more ambitious 2030 NDC on October, following wide consultations, in particular within the newly established National Carbon Neutrality Commission, which is the governance platform with broader stakeholders, including civil society, academia, and businesses. The new NDC is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% in 2030 compared to 2018 levels. In May 2022, the new government was formed, and it meant significant changes in energy policy. Newly elected President Yoon promised to build a powerful nuclear power country as one of his 10 pledges, and it contradicts the former government's gradual nuclear phase-out plan. Anyhow, the President Yoon announced that the new government would keep the 2050 carbon neutrality declaration and overall NDC target. However, the Korean New Deal frame is yet to be sufficiently reinvigorated by the new government. It is regrettable that the Korean New Deal was not mentioned at all in the economic policy direction of new government, which was released on June this year. Now, I'd like to sum up this 2 years history of Korean Green New Deal and give some qualitative assessment about it. In terms of policy priority, overall development can be evaluated as positive. Right after announcing the Korean Green New Deal framework, it was placed on the top of national political agenda. However, it is regrettable that the new government is yet to be sufficiently reinvigorate the frame. Despite the criticism that the Korean Green New Deal bundles several already existing projects together, the financial endowment of the project was significant because it acquired an additional budget of 1.4 trillion Korean won in 2020, just after the announcing the plan. However, overall level of investment remains insufficient, and the target year up to 2025 was not enough to bring about a fundamental green transition in Korea. Lastly, with the adoption of the Carbon Neutrality Act in 2021, the legal basis of the Korean Green New Deal has been strengthened. This act gives the legal binding power to the mid and long-term greenhouse gas reduction targets. Lastly, I'd like to wrap up this presentation by making policy suggestions for refining Korean Green New Deal. First of all, it should establish mid and long-term transformational nature of the framework. That is, it should expand its time scope beyond 2025. Well-designed long-term perspectives framework can make reasonable and cost-effective green transition. Secondly, to strengthen its legal competence, the Green New Deal umbrella should be reinforced directly under the mandate of the president. Given the very centralized political system, its political priority and following financial endowment can be improved with the presidential attention. Then, concrete lighthouse transformational roadmaps and projects should be not only identified, but also implemented. With these endeavors, Korea can promote its political and economic leadership in Asian region when it comes to the fight against climate change. Thank you for attention.
Thanks a lot, Serok, for this also very comprehensive overview of the Korean Green New Deal framework and the latest evolution, specifically, I would say, the concern that it has been pretty much reduced since the new government took office, but also the interesting proposal you make, and that we also address in the report on how this overall framework could be reinforced. We'll continue our little world tour and go now all the way to the US. Actually, we'll go back to Germany, but Janek Steitz, who is project manager at Agora, and also a fellow of Decent Nat Zukunft, will give us an overview of the, I think, very exciting development that we saw in the US, which is not formally a Green Deal policy, but which has been perceived by the international community as a very strong, maybe turning point in climate commitment of the US. So, Janek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. And hello to everyone. Let me share my slides as well. Okay, Dimitri, I think everyone can see it, right? Then let's dive in. I'm very pleased to briefly discuss the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is for a good part climate, energy, and industrial policy agenda. We have at Ditsanat wrote a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act and basically argued that it's a wolf clothing, and yeah, you'll see why that is. So let's have a bit of background on how climate and energy policy in the United States actually developed. He brought forward the carbon paper, so basically climate policy bill that focused on carbon pricing, but this bill did not have a political majority. Americans really weren't very fond of carbon pricing as a main system for driving climate policy. Being sort of a near standstill. So we were at the near standstill under the Trump presidency. And then there was sort of an alignment in the background, mainly within the progressive climate and left center community around the need for a Green New Deal and some ambitious climate policy to drive climate action in the US. And that was sort of brought together in Biden's Build Back Better agenda that he brought forward as part of his policy agenda for the presidency. And in the end, that resulted sort of through a number of negotiations with the right-wing part of the Democratic Party in the Inflation Reduction Act. And you'll see why this is actually called the Inflation Reduction Act while being climate legislation. So on the left panel here, you see what the IRA, that's how it's the short version of the Inflation Reduction Act is called, what provisions it actually entails. And starting from the bottom, you see that the IRA, based on these estimates from McKinsey, is supposed to drive additional revenue by 730 billion. So that's quite extensive, mainly through a reform of prescription drug pricing and corporate minimum tax. So there's additional income through the IRA. And then we have, looking in the spending side, the healthcare affordability program, and in particular, a huge program for climate and energy spending, almost worth $400 billion. And on the right panel, you can see what this energy and climate funding actually entails. And the main instrument that we see is tax incentives, tax credits mainly, so sort of a rebate that you get at the end of the year on on your taxes, so subsidy, in a sense. And you can see here that the main sort of sectors that benefit from the IRA is most and for all the power sector. So there's a lot of tax credits for building out renewables throughout the country. But then we also subsequently have the other sectors with less of a focus, but still there's a lot of money going into it. The building sector, transport sector, then there's some particular manufacturing part, so tax credits for building out manufacturing capacity. And we also have a green finance bit through a loan program that I will say more about in just a little bit. On the right panel, you see that the Inflation Reduction Act really is a tipping point in terms of how much money the US is spending on climate action. It's almost tripling of their funding going into climate, and the Inflation Reduction Act in the light blue, 40 billion roughly per year between 2020 and 2029, the main contributor. But then there's also the Chips and Science Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was sort of brought forward beginning of last year, that focused in particular on infrastructure. Now, while these 400 billion really seem like a lot of money, and I mean, I think you can see already that the IRA is mainly about funding and not about standards and CO2 pricing so much. There's even estimates that the funding could be twice as much as what was estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. You see that in this chart. So the light blue sort of bars at the bottom of the chart, these are the official estimates of the Congressional Budget Office. And they rely on an assumption of how many sort of renewable projects are actually built, because these tax credits are not capped. And then there's estimates here from the Credit Suisse Bank that actually most of these companies will demand much more of these credits, and the total funding could actually be more like 800 billion instead of 400 billion. And just to sort of compare these figures, because it's always a bit difficult to see how much money that really is in absolute terms. The 400 billion is around 0.3% of GDP in the state. And if it goes up to 800 billion, that would be around 0.7% of GDP. And we have in Germany public funding in the KTF, the Klima- und Transformationsfonds, roughly around 40 billion per year, which translates to around 1% of GDP. So the Inflation Reduction Act is sort of almost on the level of the funding that we have in focus on certain industries, and that makes it kind of challenging from a competition perspective, which we will see in a bit. I don't want to go into much detail about all these tax credits, but what you can see here is that basically there's tax credits for all sectors, for the power sector, for hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, for the transport sector, especially for clean vehicles, for charging infrastructure. Then there is a manufacturing bit, which focuses on the manufacturing of these products. So you get basically additional tax credits for setting up new manufacturing capacity, including for PV, for wind, for batteries, for mining minerals in the state. And then a very, very important additional part is that the IRA contains standards. And that's not so much green standards that we talk about a lot in the EU and in Germany, but it's standard to buy American, so local content requirements. And he sort of gives additional tax credits. So if a battery is manufactured in the States as opposed to in Europe, for example, then you get additional money for that. And then for some areas, there's even tough requirements. So for example, for batteries, there needs to be a certain threshold met of the production in the US, or otherwise you won't be eligible for funding. And that, of course, sort of benefits then companies who produce these batteries and other clean tech in the States. And then we have another very important standard. Many of the tax credits are tied to a requirement in terms of which wages are paid. And there is a section in the IRA that says, in order to be eligible for the funding, companies need to pay a prevailing wage and meet certain apprenticeship requirements. And that's really novel because it's prevailing wage even goes beyond a minimum wage. Basically, it says you need to pay your workers well, otherwise you won't get this kind of funding. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why the IRA has a lot of political support, and also across the parties and in the US population. Now, one reason why the IRA is also has received a lot of support is that when we look at the states that have a lot of potential for green technologies, here now solar and wind, we see that many of these states are Republican states. So it's basically a bipartisan sort of effort, even though none of the Republican senators voted for it. It's very likely that the IRA will have a lasting impact because really Americans all across the country from both parties benefit from this legislation. And now in terms of climate, what will it actually sort of bring? It is really a tipping point in terms of emission reduction. We see here that with the current policy, the United States will sort of manage to get minus 30% of emission reduction based on the 2005 values. And then with the Inflation Reduction Act, the additional 10% of emission reduction until 2030, quite something for one single piece of legislation. But we also see that this is not yet enough for the US to really be on a Paris Agreement pathway that would sort of entail 50 to 52 emission reduction until 2030. So additional legislation is needed to drive emission reduction to be on a Paris Agreement pathway. Now, one last slide. There has been a lot of talk about the potential implications of the Inflation Reduction Act on Europe and on Germany. There's talk of a trade war. There has been news that Tesla and other companies want to offshore production from Germany to America because of these really generous subsidies. And one of the reasons for that is these local content requirements that I have been talking about. So let's first have a look here on the sort of threat side. Of course, manufacturers that are selling to the US that can not longer sell to the US or not receive these subsidies because of these local content requirements, that can be a discrimination if these standards are not changed. And we hear from the press, or we can read in the press, that Macron is currently in the US talking to Biden about this. There's a special task force between these countries to sort these things out. But there's a risk that European and German companies will be discriminated in the US. There's also a big risk that there will be an uncoordinated and healthy European response to the IRA because now the IRA will go into effect beginning of next year, and there's a lot of worries about this now. But of course, as we know, it takes time and it's complicated to find a European response. And we already see that France and Germany are moving forward while other countries are really hesitant. So there is this risk that the response will be uncoordinated. One more thread I want to highlight. There has also been talk about now to initiate retaliation measures in the form of green standards. So basically, that also within the European Union, there will now be standards have to be met by companies. And one idea is to do this through green standards. And there is a risk that the introduction of these standards could also discourage developing countries. So if they can no longer export their products to the EU, and that's something from a climate perspective that we have to really be conscious about when talking about a European response. But to end on a sort of good and positive note, there is also huge opportunities from the IRA. It's the tipping point in US emission reduction, as I have already said. There will be great learning effects in cost reduction that countries internationally will benefit from. And I think Claudio will go more into this. It will also be an impetus for really European industrial policy agenda. At least it's a chance, an opportunity to do that. And hopefully it will also be an impetus for a new discussion around the European fiscal facility and a coordinated approach to really bring forward climate and industrial policy in the European Union. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Janek, for your presentation. Unfortunately, the sound was not always perfect, but I hope it was sufficiently clear for our audience. And in case it was not, I'm sure the slides will be available also later on. Thank you for the three of you to have presented these different views on Green Deal stimulus, Green Deal policies in 3 different regions of the world. We received some questions regarding the investment typically, but if you allow me, I would like maybe to start the discussion. We have about 15 minutes. I would like to go through 3 different aspects. The first one is really about implementation of Green Deal policies, also based on the latest development that we saw. The second one would be more this question, Janek, that you just addressed, which is about the potential competition or distortion of international trades based on green stimulus, national or regional strategies. And the last one would be the question of investment. So let's start with the policy priority. And Claudio, I would be interested to get your view. Do you think this framework, which was actually politically very much carried 2 or 3 years ago, is still a main priority, this Green Deal framework of Europe currently at the European level, and especially in the context of all the new measures which have been adopted in the context of the energy crisis? Is it aligned, in your view, still with the long-term commitment and objective of the Green Deal strategy?
Indeed, a lot has happened since 2019, the pandemic, the energy crisis, geopolitical crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as I mentioned in my presentation, what you're referring to in these changing circumstances of the last year, the European response is in the REPowerEU plan. And there you have some conflicting aspects, because you have on the one side you have that there is a lot of effort to stimulate investment in renewables and in energy efficiency, because of course if you want to reduce your reliance on gas, and Europe doesn't have much of gas resources, so the only sustainable way to stop this dependence on gas is actually reducing the use of gas. But on the other hand, there is also the need for the short term to invest in gas infrastructures. And therefore, you have in the REPowerEU plan that the Commission kind of backtracked, for instance, on some principles that put forward previously, like the do not significant harm principle in the spending in the recovery plans, that was excluding basically any kind of public support to gas infrastructures and fossil fuel infrastructures, not just gas, but also more broadly, because also other type of fossil fuels will now be allowed under certain circumstances to be financed through the through the recovery plans in this context of crisis and geopolitical and energy security issues, concerns. And therefore, yes, there are some conflicts there. And however, and the balance is, I see it as strongly in favor of an acceleration of the implementation of the EU Green Deal and of the decarbonization, even if, of course, there will be a switch away from gas to, in the short term, to coal and other more polluting fossil fuels. But still, I mean, I was looking at the data on Eurostat on quarterly emissions, greenhouse gases emissions. Still, you see that in Q2 2022 emissions were still lower than the corresponding quarter in 2019. So the increase in emissions so far, it doesn't really materialize.
Okay, thanks. So it's good to hear that it can be actually an accelerator. So this energy crisis for actually a quicker implementation in the long run, even if there is kind of temporary measures indeed that needs to be tackled. There have been an important policy change also in Korea. Sarah, you mentioned this new president and the way the Green Deal framework is kind of put a bit into a new perspective. Could you tell us what is the new Korean government climate policy ambition? And do you think the Green New Deal framework could be reinvigorated a bit along the line you presented? Is it something which would be possible to get in the new Korean policy context?
First of all, as it is stated in the presentation, the new government promised to keep the formal administration's overall climate targets, such as carbon neutrality by 2050 and keeping the target of 2030 NDC. However, as it is said before, the new government is trying to change some reduction measures, such as adjusting some electricity mix between renewables and the nuclear. Second of all, the government seems to make emphasize on the green growth. The concept of green growth has been famous in the Korean society at the far more previous administrations of 2009. So this year, the previous Carbon Neutrality Committee, which works for reviewing the NDC and establishing specific sectoral roadmap, has changed its name as Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth Committee. The concept of green growth is stimulating the economy with the green innovation, green job creation, and so on. So there could be some similar characteristics between Green New Deal and green growth as an economic stimulus framework. However, there has not been made yet neither specific financial endowment to support the green transition in Korea, nor one big framework to encompass the various projects. So to wrap up my answer, I can see the hope for a reinvigoration of green transition promoting framework, but the name can be changed to more emphasize in the economics stimulus aspects.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sarah. It's hopefully an optimistic prospect. Yannick, I would like to get your view. You mentioned the IRA as really mostly, I would say, an incentive program, not so much a regulation program with long-term vision. And I was wondering, in terms of implementation, do you see a risk that with a change of the administration in the US in 2 years, basically we may have actually a weakening of the overall framework? So globally, how can the US ensure the alignment between this program and its long-term net zero goals?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dimitri. I mean, there's always the risk that you can roll back a subsidy program, and that risk exists for the IRA as well. And if we look how the Republicans have voted on the IRA, then we see none of the Republicans in the Senate have actually voted in favor. But then on the other hand, we also see, and I think I showed this chart, that most of the benefits actually go to Republican states, and that's really an inherent feature of this subsidy program. And that also has to do with the fact that Just there's a lot of potential for green technologies, for wind, for solar, for battery production and others in Republican states. So with these massive financial incentives, I think it would be very hard for the Republican Party if they came into power in the next election, let's say. I think it would be really tough to communicate that to the public. There's strong support for the IRA. And so I'm actually fairly confident that this program will not be rolled back. And most economic commentators actually see the biggest risk for the IRA, for the implementation, really on the permitting side. So mention one of the Democratic senators who was also mainly responsible for, let's say, the final version of the IRA. He wanted to bring forward also a permitting legislation, and that was not passed. So they have, similar to how it is in Germany, a bit of a permitting problem, and that actually is a risk for rapid implementation. But politically wise, and from the politics and population, I think the IRA has a lot of support.
Okay, thanks a lot, Yannick. Let's move on to the second point I wanted to address, and I think this is one of the hottest topics in this whole discussion. Are green stimulus actually protective instruments? And Yannick, you showed quite clearly that America First is in the core, actually, of the design of the IRA. And you mentioned the European Union is actually putting some pressure. There is discussion. Macron was in the US, or he's still in the US now. I would be specifically interested to get Claudio first, your view on this. What should be the political response of the Europe to this ambitious Inflation Reduction Act, in your view?
Well, yes, Europe has been traditionally defender of free trade, and always try to avoid this kind of protectionist interventions. And also, for instance, if you look at CBAM, there was still kind of, might be considered as a trade friction, but still it was clear in the CBAM discussion that if other countries collaborate and also implement climate policies, they will be exempted somehow. In this case, well, this is not really in the same kind of level of discussion. This is purely protectionist. So, I think that Europe will have not many options, as Yannick also hinted at, that to actually go into a similar direction, because in terms of funding, we already have quite a lot of funding for supporting green investment, at least in comparable terms with what the US has. But what is really different is this protectionist clause that, and it's a challenge for because Europe is very export driven. So the US it's an important market. So this Europe will have to find. I think the most sustainable way is actually to go more for subsidies to manufacturing, trying to support local industries without putting out local content clause, but rather to support financially the domestic manufacturing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very clear. I think we will have a lot of discussion on that in the next few weeks and months, probably. I feel like the political priority is heating up. Let's see from the South Korean perspective. You mentioned, Claudio, Europe is an exporting country. Korea is a very important exporting nation and industrial nation. Sarok, can you give us some insights about how Korea is reacting both to the Inflation Reduction Act, with this kind of tax credit for American-based products, but also to the CBAM discussion that we see in Europe? Both of them could potentially hinder Korean competitiveness. Is it a driver for the climate discussion in Korea, or is it rather perceived only from a trade point of view, limitation on trade with other big partners?
Okay, that's quite a complex question, but I'd like to distinguish the answers by each possible impact and expected impact from Korean side. So first of all, regarding the CBAM, I think sorry. I think that CBAM already contributed to the formation of the social consensus on the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I think at some point it has some positive effects on Korean, which is severely export-oriented economy. So like, because after the announcing of the CBAM, people really started to think about that the climate risk can be converted into economic one. So in terms of the economic impact, I think like it will depend on our strategy and like responsiveness to the green transition. Like as we move faster, then the more opportunities would be there. But anyway, like to answer that, would it be threaten or some opportunity to Korea? Like, I think it already works as an acceleration factor for Korean decarbonization, especially in industry area. And in terms of IRA, I think because this is quite recent policy announcement, so response for the IRA is quite mixed in Korea, I think. Actually, like right after the announcement of IRA, there were a lot of worrying for Korean automobile companies because they could lose their US market share in electric vehicle markets. But at the same time, Korean stock market is expecting the benefits to the Korean battery manufacturers. So maybe the response was quite complex. So maybe we should see how will be communicated between two governments, between the US and Korean. However, in terms of energy transition technologies, anyway, like there are some expectations for the rapid growth in technology development of renewables and green hydrogen. Maybe overall learning effect and economies of scale, and like following the reduction in cost in the US can have some ramification for the Korean industry, such as earlier technology development or commercialization, as it was experienced in the battery markets before. So it's not easy. It's not easy to assert, but maybe there could be more transition technology related support in the future, I think. And last but not the least, but I think it's like quite a symbolic meaning. It has some symbolic meaning for us. It's like US is really coming back to the climate society again. So it would mean that the global pressure of the decarbonization of Korea could be heavier without exception. So I think that could also act as an acceleration of Korean decarbonization. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, for this answer. I see we are already running out of time, and I'm sorry for the audience. We are already 3 minutes beyond schedule. So unfortunately, we will not have time to address the final dimension that I wanted to discuss on investment. But I think some answers has been provided in the chat box already. So let me just wrap up. I think there is an interesting dynamics currently as seen by these three presentations and these three different perspectives on green growth in South Korea, Europe, and the US. Priority is a quick and a robust implementation with different actually angles. It will be important to see the interaction of these strategies to be sure that we are not going to a race towards protectionist measures or local content, which may actually damage also some other broader international trade policies. And finally, and we will address this maybe in the future, the question of investment needs to meet the growth of renewable energy deployment and other green technologies to meet the net zero will be actually a very important challenge. So having said that, I was very happy to have you on board here today, and I pass back the mic to my colleague Nicola, who will give you the closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much